Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Pete Aber. I'm Executive Director of MassEcon. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us for this discussion, Diversity and Equity in Massachusetts Economic Development. In terms of how the program will go this morning, we will have just a couple opening remarks, and then we're very happy to have Secretary Lauren Jones join us for opening remarks on our subject. And then we'll go to the actual panel discussion moderated by Tom Brown from Mass Bio. And that will begin sometime a little after 10:30. We will have opportunities for Q&A with the moderated through our moderator, and so there'll be time at the end of the panel discussion for all of you to provide questions. So with that, let me start with some thank yous. We want to thank at MassEcon, want to thank VHB, which has joined us over the course of the last 12 months as one of our champion sponsors. So they've been part of every one of our events over the course of the last 12 months. Also want to thank our own Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, which has been chaired by Jeff Howell, who's here today from DLA Piper, formerly also co-chaired by Tag McClory from THM Advisors. I don't see Tag here, but I believe he's coming. And Sanjay Iyer from the town of Lexington, who you'll be hearing from a little bit later on the panel. We're very appreciative for the works of our committee, and this event really was, came out of discussions over our own EDI committee over a number of months, and so we're very appreciative for all their hard work. And of course, we're very appreciative for Nutter, our host sponsor for this event, for providing us this great space. Nutter's a great member of ours, and we're so glad that they've been able to step up and support us with providing this great venue for this discussion. And with that, I want to welcome Dan Mulhern, co-chair Public Policy Boston for Nutter, for some welcome remarks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm putting my remarks down because Peter just put me in a really difficult spot. He stole basically everything that I was going to say to you this morning. So on behalf of Nutter, our two managing partners, Liam O'Connell and Mike Scott, and a number of my colleagues that are in the room, welcome to our space. We've been around for a long time. If you don't know much about Nutter, somewhere in the neighborhood of 140 years. And I'm relatively new to the Nutter team. I've been here for about 2 years, spent most of my time with this gentleman who is walking in right now in government service. And I'm thrilled that Lauren Jones, Secretary Jones, is also walking in the room. She's a former colleague that I worked with when I spent some time with Mayor Walsh. And we at Nutter are incredibly excited about the conversation today. Some of the founding principles that have been really important to our team and to the folks that put Nutter on the map were making sure that we were doing the best we could to reflect and serve the communities and constituencies that we represent. We've been doing it for a long time, and I think pretty successfully. So with that said, please enjoy the conversation this morning. I was told that brevity was my best friend, so I'm trying to stay on track. I'm going to pass it back over to Peter. Welcome.
So for those of you who don't know about MassEcon, we've been around for a number of years, since 1993. We're a statewide economic development nonprofit. We do a lot of things in support of our economic development mission, and that in concert with our friends in state government. So we're a proud member of Team Massachusetts, and what do we do on that team? We do marketing of Massachusetts to as a place to do business. We focus on corporate site selectors around the world and tell them the Massachusetts story. We're sit on a mountain of data that we provide. We're sort of an open source for data and economic and demographic data and business data. we're a membership organization as well. And so we're a convener of conversations like this and many others over the course of the year. We're probably best known for our site selection services that we provide in concert with our partners in state government. Last year, we were very active, about 82 site location projects that we're involved in, 13 of which landed in Massachusetts, over 1,000 jobs created by those 13 companies. They are absorbing over 1 million square feet of commercial space in Massachusetts. So, that's an important part of our mission. And our mission statement is, as you see on the screen, to promote and champion Massachusetts as a place to do business. That part of the mission is very apparent, very tangible. We can show metrics in terms of how we're successful in doing that. But the other parts of our mission statement we're still really working on when we talk about inclusive business ecosystem, promoting a diverse talent pool, expanding equitable opportunities. Those are a little bit more challenging for us as measures. And through our work of our EDI committee, we have striven to become more diverse in terms of our membership, in terms of our leadership, but we also paused as an economic development practitioner in the field just how diverse is the economic development field in Massachusetts, in which we work every day. And so really that led us to this conversation today, where we will be asking of our speakers to assist us with answering some key questions. How is diversity represented among practitioners in Massachusetts? And as someone who's been around economic development, in and around economic development for over 20 years, probably we don't have the kind of diversity that we truly need in positions of such importance around Massachusetts. How does or does not the concept of equity in spreading economic opportunity, how does that really play out in terms of our programming here in Massachusetts? And as importantly, what are best practices out there that we can shine a light on and seek to emulate in other areas of state, local, regional economic development? So that's really part of the discussion today. And really, we're very fortunate to have our keynote speaker today, Secretary Lauren Jones, who heads the Massachusetts Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development. So she will help set the table for us in our discussion with her opening remarks, and we'll then segue to the panel discussion. For those of us who have been in economic development for a long time, the appointment of Lauren Jones as Secretary of Labor and Workforce Development was a cause for celebration, truly. Someone who is so well known in economic development and in the business community and in the workforce space. So we're just we all celebrated her appointment and have been celebrating ever since, as she's brought change to the Department of the Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Secretary Lauren Jones.
Wow, well, Pete really set the bar high for these keynote remarks to help frame your panel, which I am so pleased to see as such an esteemed set of panelists joining for today's event. And I really want to just start by thanking Pete, Dan, others for extending the opportunity to be part of today's event and really an important conversation. I applaud MassEcon for leaning into this topic, knowing how essential diversity and driving greater equity in all things economic development, but especially knowing how important it is to expand diversity among your members as well. I'll just take a moment to share a little bit about kind of my reflection of how I came to be where I am, but also how I'm using this really unique opportunity for once in a lifetime kind of opportunity as secretary to think about diversity and how I think it connects back to the work that you do each and every day. For me, I did not study city planning, arts and culture, or real estate in college. I was a political science major, and during my time in studying political science, I was laser focused on government and government structure and not recognizing or even gaining exposure to appreciate how important parts of government are interconnected and how government can play a role in driving economic opportunity. If I look back to 2006, I volunteered for a candidate's gubernatorial campaign, a less known name at the time, Deval Patrick. At the time, I was fresh out of college, working in insurance, and looking to find that spark to find ways to plug into politics. And I found phone banking to be my calling card at the time. But it was through this experience that I became friends with someone who ended up joining Governor Patrick's legal office day one in the administration. And so I grabbed a coffee with him early on and gained insight into how he saw the administration unfolding and where I could maybe find myself. And so I was incredibly fortunate to have my first job in state government, working in the Massachusetts Office of Business Development, my first job in government, and I actually had the opportunity to serve as project manager for the Economic Development Incentive Program, following the heels of past leaders like Pete Hebert in that space. But that's also where I learned more about government in the economic development space, connecting with MassEcon, one of the first meetings I probably had, mass development, all the different local planners, town administrators, people that were on the ground mapping out the future of their communities, whether it was business expansion and the job growth that would come through programs like the EDIP program. So as exciting as these early years were for me in really providing foundation in economic development, I don't think I experienced firsthand the value of representation in economic development or in government for me personally until I had the opportunity to work for the city of Boston, where I got a crash course in really serving and working with people closest to the work that we do. It was Tim Murray who always said that local government is closest to the people and you really see the impact. And that is where I saw how important diversity matters and why representation across all backgrounds matters. It was during this experience that I also merged my interest in workforce development with economic development, working closely with the Boston Planning and Development Agency, seeing the value of tools like community benefit agreements to unlock job opportunities for local residents, especially as we were seeing the growing areas like in life sciences, and now you have Mayor Wu laser focused on creating job opportunities in the life sciences, especially for underrepresented populations right here in Boston, including people of color and low-income residents. Diversity and equity are essential to business, and I think that's exactly why this room is filled here with a range of people representing so many different backgrounds that come together to lift up economic development. And I think it's also so relevant as you think of this as a moral imperative as well as a business imperative, not just for the CEO of a financial service company, but it's just as important as you think about that real estate developer, that city planner, any role that takes to help build our communities, whether you're talking about the capital of Massachusetts or the smallest rural community in our Commonwealth. It really is important to make sure that we anchor a focus on people, and at the end of the day, a diverse group of people will help to influence the decisions that we end up seeing within our communities. Throughout my career, I have been deeply committed to advancing economic and workforce development, and I think I've created this constant theme, if you will, especially in my role now as secretary, to make sure that we are focused on our people. It's what makes organizations thrive. It's who makes decisions within organizations. And as you think about your pipeline, your workforce, it unlocks more opportunities that you're seeing. And you'll hear from our panelists today, I'm sure, in their own experiences, as well as we think about the workforce that this industry across economic development, more specifically real estate and other areas, why it's so important. For me as secretary, I'm incredibly humbled to be able to do this role, looking at every single day 2 women leaders. The first time we have this in Massachusetts, but I think it also leads to why we lead with values as a Healy Driscoll administration. And that is why I thought it was so important as we mapped out our first workforce agenda as an administration to anchor it on people, and ensuring that as we think about ways to attract, retain, and develop our talent, we are centering that on people and being more intentional. So we have now a workforce development agenda, and we call out more strategies to make sure that we are being intentional with providing opportunities for low-income residents in Massachusetts, thinking about strategies that lift up individuals with different abilities, thinking about ways to unlock opportunities for more people of color, veterans, women. And that takes intentionality. When I say that, it means thinking about, say, barriers that we know have long existed for many of these populations that have often left people on the sidelines as we're recovering from the pandemic, things that are maybe keeping people out of the labor market, so think childcare. And how can we create more infrastructure to ensure that people can access not only quality but affordable childcare. Think about transportation and how that plays into economic development planning, but also allowing for a worker to get from point A to point B, not only in a job training program, but persist and be successful to then thrive in a career. I'll just spotlight a couple tools in our toolbox that we are using within the Healy Driscoll administration that I think could be useful as you think about ways to lift up workforce development in your respective organizations, and hopefully for MassEcon to continue to plug. One is registered apprenticeship, and 2 is skills-based hiring. And you may think, I don't know if this is applicable in my workspace, but I'll help to illustrate exactly how. So registered apprenticeship, raise your hand if you are familiar with registered apprenticeship. Okay, not everybody. Well, now think about your plumber that you may have called, your electrician, a carpenter, people that are putting cranes in your economic development plans. Many of these individuals have created a career through registered apprenticeship. It is a proven path that provides classroom training to provide the technical skills, the credentials, combined with on the job, being at that work site as the plumber, as the carpenter. And that combination with the right number of hours and credentials is yielding a career for these roles, but also greater economic mobility, great wages, benefits that come with this career. It's been proven for now over a century. It's well embedded in European countries like Switzerland and Germany, and we need to play catch up in not only how it's applicable in the building trades, but also in expanded industries like the life sciences, in clean energy, in advanced manufacturing. Major industries that you care about because it's going to unlock more economic development and opportunities in each of our cities and towns. But I think that this is also a tool that we know is proven in the building trades, and so we're going bigger and making sure that we are intentional in creating more diversity within the building trades, an aging workforce that we also know could use a boost in diversity within the construction and building trades. So we're creating more pathways for pre-apprenticeships and apprenticeships through investments with the administration, partnership with the legislature to unlock opportunities in the building trades for more women and people of color. But we also know that this model is helping to unlock opportunities for your next life sciences technician or your next CNC machinist in advanced manufacturing. And so it made me think, how can this be applicable as you're thinking about some of those in-demand roles that are in economic development, but you're finding hard to fill, whether you're in a local community or you're thinking about your developer and real estate company. So think about what are those roles that may be hard to fill, and you want to invest in your own talent, and now start thinking about how you can identify the industry recognized credentials and shape a registered apprenticeship program. We in the administration are more than willing to roll up our sleeves, answer a call, work through some technical assistance to make sure that you can leverage this tool, whether you're thinking about taking on a couple of apprentices or you want to build a cohort of 50 apprentices. We want to make sure that we're thinking with you on how to do exactly that. And we've got tools in the toolbox, including incentives, to make sure that you're able to do so and a team ready to work with you. The second tool in our toolbox is skills-based hiring. Coming into the administration, I learned that a couple states had already started to do this and think about how within executive branch departments you can lean on skills-based hiring. That's thinking about someone's skills over a degree where a degree may not necessarily be needed. And so I learned through talking with our state's human resource division that they had already done a lot of due diligence to recognize that many roles within the executive branch did not actually require a four-year degree. And so Governor Healy at the start of this year instituted skills-based hiring within the executive branch through an executive order. And we've been coaching and training and preparing our human resource managers across all secretariats to embed this policy as we think about how to attract more talent, retain and upskill existing talent, and develop the talent that we have. Just as much as we're an employer, we have 40,000 plus employees. And so how can this be a tool for us? But we also know there's so many companies that have already been instituting skills-based hiring and those that are curious about how they can adopt this within their own organizations. So I also encourage you to think about this within your workspaces. Just like I described at the top, I did not study economic development in college. I did not walk away with a degree in economic development. And I know there are plenty of roles, especially those early career and entry-level roles, that would not require a four-year degree for someone to get their start, but they may have the skills. They may have been super active as a young person in their city, and they could then go on to be the city's chief of economic development. And there are so many more stories like that that can help unlock the talent that you need to champion economic development within your communities, the opportunities that we know are right there, ready and ripe to create more prosperity. And at the end of the day, when you think about your economic development goals, that's also then leading to greater opportunities for the people within those communities, including the workforce, but also people that look to live, work, and play here. And so it's all connected. All roads lead back to workforce development, whether you realize it now or you will after today's discussion. And I hope that this helps provide some good framing, but I know you have such an esteemed panel moderated by Tom that will probably unlock and spark more dialogue and discussion. I'm glad that I was able to just provide a little bit of framing, but encourage you guys to really lean in, be more intentional, and look to your peers and so many other people that are dedicated to this to help you as you drive more economic opportunity, economic growth, and at the end of the day, greater diversity within economic development. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak.
Well, I'm going to ask our moderator and panelists to assume their positions up on this stage. I want to make a couple more acknowledgments among our audience members. I referenced Teg McClory, a former co-chair of our EDI committee, and Teg has joined us this morning. Thank you very much, Teg. And Bonnie Sullivan, our chair, Bonnie Sullivan, Middlesex Savings Bank, chair of our board of directors. And so, Bonnie, thank you for joining us this morning. So just a couple points on what the secretary spoke of, spot on in terms of, before MassEcon, I was at the Mass Bioed Foundation, and previously to that, Mass Bio. And when we looked at hiring practices in the life sciences industry, we absolutely, we had academics saying we don't know why at the associates level we're producing people fully capable of X number of positions in the industry, but they are pitching the job listings at the bachelor or the bachelor or master's or PhD level. It didn't make any sense. And it took a real conversation with the life sciences industry to get them to start changing about how they were actually listing these positions. The other point on credentialing, and as I think we'll hear from our panelists, as we heard from Secretary Jones, there's no pathway into an economic development position. There aren't degree programs out there really in economic development specifically. And so there really isn't a lot of credentialing in the industry. And Sanjay Iyer from town of Lexington with us at MassEcon, along with the University of Massachusetts Lowell, we're exploring the concept of an academy that we would host at MassEcon that could provide some basic for economic developers that are out there in positions or who aspire to be in economic development, provide them some basics in an academy approach, and then have that transition to a program at UMass Lowell that will provide additional credentialing. So they're talking about reinstituting something called the Regional Economic and Social Development Program at UMass Lowell. So that would present perhaps a pathway to economic development positions or help support those that are in those positions. But as we think of diversity, it would also provide us an opportunity to really outreach to the communities of color to participate and to be part of that pathway, so that we could perhaps expand the number of positions in the industry that are in the economic development field that are truly represent the diversity of our state. So with that, we're going to jump right into the discussion, and I'm going to ask our moderator, Tom Brown from Mass Bio, to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and as they do so, talk about their own pathway to their current positions. And so with that, Tom Brown.
Thank you, Pete. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Brown, the Director of DEI at Mass Bio, and I have the pleasure of not just moderating today's panel, but really working in this space, which is so important. And I just want to start off by commending MassEcon and Nutter for hosting this. I think, ironically, at a time when I believe these kind of discussions are needed most, becoming easier to not have them. And so, thank you, Pete, for hosting us here. Anyway, you're not here to hear me and my thoughts, unless you love the British accent. So, panelists, please, introduce yourselves, tell us what you do now, but importantly, and as Secretary Jones did so well, tell us a bit about your route into this work, because we know it's certainly not linear. Sandhya, I'll start with you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sandhya Iyer. I'm the Economic Development Director for the town of Lexington. Just like Secretary Jones started with a career which was not focused on life sciences, I started my career in communications, by the way, and then I'm an immigrant, of course. I started on a dependent visa. I was here for 7 years, not working, out of job, out of everything, out of career, and didn't know how my pathway was going, because back in India, I was a producer, and I used to produce movies as well as FM radio, shows. So from that career to sitting at home was like challenging, to put it underlying challenging. So after that, after a long thought, I went to Northeastern University, did my master's in communication and project management. I was literally focused on technology and technology companies. Again, education is very important, and as Secretary Jones said, your pathway is going to be so different and challenging how you start your career. So my focus was like getting into a technology company and getting into project management, and that was my focus for a long time. And then my first job was as an intern or a co-op with Mass Life Sciences Center. And that's it. I was like, oh, I found my calling right there. I was like, I did not know I could go into, government job like that. Mass Life Sciences Center changed my pathway completely. I was very lucky to get mentors early on, like Ben Bradford. He was one
Who's
of
my boss, by the way?
Ben is a good friend and a colleague, and we both started the first business development team back in Mass Life Sciences Center and worked as part of MassEcon and Mass Development as part of the team Massachusetts to start with. And that's when I started doing codename project, and we started going to cities and towns and recruiting new life sciences companies to different cities and towns. My curiosity with economic development started there. I was ground up, learning about cities and towns and how once a company starts in a city and town, how does the permitting process start? And that's how my career started. After 6 years with Mass Life Sciences Center, I went to Lexington. I'm still there as the economic development director.
Brilliant, thank you. Maybe your career in radio means you should be sitting here. No, thank you so much. Marcos, please tell us your story.
How I got here is a question I ask myself often. I don't always have a response, but I'll try. So I actually grew up in Puerto Rico, and by the time I got to college, even though I was like a computer geek and I loved like databases and stuff like that, I realized I had more social inclination. And so I did kind of go more like the normal credentialing route. I did study economics and political science, and there was institutional pathways in for me, like high visibility internships and economic development agencies in Puerto Rico. Opted to do a master's in public affairs and policy at Princeton, and ultimately my route through my wife led me to Western Massachusetts via New York City, where I started directing economic development in the city of Holyoke, which is now over half Latino, mostly Puerto Rican as well. It was somewhat important for the mayor to have representation on his cabinet. I was the first Latino to hold that position. And a lot of the mindset that I developed, particularly in the US context of diversity and inclusion, it was just based on the question of who does this impact? Who is this for, right? If we're rehabbing a neighborhood, who is benefiting? Is it from the folks who have suffered here for 50 years, or it's for a brand new constituency, right? And what is the fairness in that? The jobs that we're creating, et cetera, the business opportunities. I did that for about 9 years, or almost 9 years, and then I went to Mass Development, where I am now, to lead the community development division. And as of Friday at 5 o'clock, I am the deputy director and acting CEO of the agency.
Yes, clap that.
Don't clap yet. I'm bound to make a mistake in. And we are the Commonwealth's Development and Finance Agency, and also Land Bank. So we have expertise in moving capital as a lender, guarantor. We work in the bond markets for several types of projects. We do green financing, financing of a lot of nonprofit institutions, preparing land for development, and also a robust community development apparatus that works particularly in the cities that have most suffered in the economic history of Massachusetts over the last 100 years, the gateway cities. We have a very strong presence, and we run several grant programs in partnership with the Commonwealth, or funded by the Commonwealth, including the Mass Cultural Facilities Fund, where we're a partner with Michael. Thank you, Michael, for your partnership. So that's all the stuff that we do, yeah.
That's all the stuff that we do.
I'm sure I missed some.
Yeah. Congratulations, firstly. And for me, what's significant there is the thread of humanity in all of this. And I think economic development can be a bit faceless or nameless, at least to people externally. And I think knowing that we've got our panelists, who've seen it, who have reasons why they're doing it, I think is so important, especially when they get elevated to positions like Marcos. So congrats. Chief, what are you doing here?
That's a great question. What am I doing here? Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. All right, that's, we've got to wake up and all that. Well, it's great to be here. First, again, congratulations. We are happy about it. And I've sufficiently buttered him up because I got to ask him for something after this. But first, I just have to say thank you to Paul and Nutter for opening their space to us today. Paul's a great friend and advisor, not just of myself, but of the mayor. And so very happy to be here. And of course, Dan mentioned that, we have some history before this, which is part of the story of how I got here, which is a very confusing and nonsensical story of how I'm sitting in this role as Chief of Economic Opportunity and Inclusion 997 days later from January of 22. But Dan has been a really good mentor and example, I would say, for myself. When I was leading the body camera movement here in Boston to equip officers with body cameras after another monumental moment in America's history, which was the death or murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Dan was a very good advisor during that conversation and laughs every time I see him, because at that time I was on the other side of government. It's rah rah and all that kind of stuff. He's like, yeah, now you know how it is, in government. So great to be here and to see him. And then, Pete has been a crucial friend of the administration and someone that we meet with on a quarterly basis to be part of that attracting folks to Massachusetts, but in particular Boston. But grateful to MassEcon for all their work. And of course, my favorite person in the world is Secretary Jones. And it just feels great to say to a friend, Madam Secretary, and we all are very proud of you and where you are. So I have sufficiently filibustered that I don't need to answer this question now of how I got to where I am. Like I said, very kind of weird story that I will condense into like a minute. But just to say that I ask myself literally all the time how I got here, because not only did I not study anything that would get me to this role, but this is not anything that I sought out in my life either. When I got into, I grew up in Boston, so a proud product of Boston Public Schools that wanted me to graduate only to make sure I got out of their schools because they just were like, please, just no more of this. I got held back in the 10th grade because I was goofing off and graduated. I won't say my GPA because then you're gonna, the economy will crater here in Boston if you know what that was. But just to say, left school, thankfully, and but had the great opportunity to, after a year at UMass Dartmouth, which is a phenomenal institution, to go to my dream school, which was Morehouse College in Atlanta. And that completely changed my direction and what I have been doing in life for two reasons. One was because, growing up in Boston, and particularly some of the schools that I was in, I was not, it wasn't as diverse as what Boston has been. And so it was interesting being in a household where my father is a Nigerian immigrant who came here in the 1970s, and my mom, who's, African-American lineage, and particularly my grandfather, who was a Baptist minister, also a Morehouse grad, and is one of the few people that actually did know Martin Luther King. You mean any person around in the 60s, they all marched with Martin Luther King. But my grandfather, who really was my life's inspiration, who was part of the group that founded the Massachusetts chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and brought King up here in '65. And so I was hearing all these stories growing up of what was actually taking place in the 50s and 60s. And that, when I finally let the lessons, when I digested all of them finally, they really have set me on a different course. Because there's one statement that my grandfather made before he passed away, which is that we have to stop confusing motion with progress. And that particular statement has resonated a lot more since he passed away, in just thinking about this great city that I grew up in and how very often we substitute substance with symbolism. And I'll get to that later on. But just to say, in terms of how I got here, I came back to Boston after graduation. I worked for a city councilor because I, at that time in 2012, was very, let's just say, not a huge supporter of government. I was part of, my first presidential election was Barack Obama. And so, of course, all of us who were very young at that time were like, hope and change in a year. And then when 2012 came around, it was like, okay, we got to keep pushing for that hope and change. Folks became, just not satisfied. But I said, rather than just assume that's what it is, let me go inside government and either prove myself right that it's all terrible, or see that actually, there are things that are happening and there's ways to change that. And it's been the latter ever since. lots of phenomenal public servants who are helping to transform this city. One of them is here, Patty Arsenal, who's I'm happy is part of my team, and who's been for a long time been working in government. But even then, I did not see my course or my trajectory in economic development. I had been in the political realm. I thought that's what I might do. I went to go work at the Ted Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. So now I was on the museum side and helping to foster this sense of patriotism and what the federal government could do in young people. And then got the bug myself and ran for office I live in Hyde Park. I ran for state rep, and that's why, of course, today I'm here as the representative from Hyde Park right now. So I lost that election. But I like to say that I am the happiest loser in Massachusetts because as a result of that campaign and that loss, the board of directors of a very nascent organization came to me and they said, we really wanted you to win, even though they didn't give any campaign donations or knock on any doors or making phone calls. But anyway, so they said they really wanted me to win, but it'd be great if actually you came and helped to run our organization. And it was this little-known organization at that time called the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, or BECMA. It was founded in 2015 as a result of the Federal Reserve study, Color of Wealth, that found that stat that I'm not going to repeat because everyone knows the stats about the $8 and everything. And so that is how I got thrown into this, but also really understanding, as the secretary mentioned, that everything kind of leads back to everything is economic development. And so what I have found in this role, and after leading BECMA for 3 years, is that that it's quite literally true, and that what is important for these particular roles that I know we'll get into, and that is just present on the stage, is that the experiences matter. Because the whole purpose of what we're doing in economic development is to help build wealth and transform communities. And so it matters that all parts of that community are represented, because you have to address some of the gaps if we're all going to succeed and move forward together.
Thank you, Shagun. And so,
Can I just,
yeah,
you're on
Marcus,
day
go for it.
997?
Yes.
Do you get a cake on day
No,
9?
you don't. You don't. I asked.
Get
Yeah.
this man some cake.
So motion versus progress. Our photographers here, people might see the photos from today and say, okay, we've done it. It's inclusive, economic inclusion and development has representation. Do we think broadly that is the case? Who wants to start laying the field for that? Are we there in terms of representation within economic development?
It's a loaded question because we are talking about a career field versus practitioners versus people who are doing economic development in their own jobs and roles. Like, I'm not the planner of the town, I'm not the town manager for the town, but I know that diversity in all those roles matter as well to bring the change that we are hoping to bring. I'm not saying that we have not become aware of EDI or equity and diversity and inclusion in different roles. Our policies. I've been working with Jeff on discussing all these things. How much of it is on paper versus how much of it are we practicing is a different thing, and it has to be something that people consciously make an effort to go out there and seek people who can actually do the role, even though they might not be the candidates who are standing out in the queue. So it's almost that's the difference. I think we are heading towards it on paper. I wish we will be there sooner rather than later.
Okay, maybe more motion than progress. What do you think, Marcus?
I'll be very controversial. Say, no, we're not there yet. I think a lot of it is just, the issues that we have to tackle is not, whether there's someone who looks like us in a particular place. It's the systemic issues, and it's the work that anyone and everyone should be doing, right? It's, I guess, the difference between not being racist and being anti-racist, right? They're just systems in place that, if we don't just think about it, will provide the same types of outcomes. So, think about, what I was talking about earlier in terms of who does this benefit, right? If you're redeveloping a city and you just look for investment, any investment that does bricks and mortar, that has an economic impact. It is moving money, it is creating value. but for who? What is that? What wealth is that creating? What opportunities is that creating, right? And I'm sure you face this all the time in your cities or towns, right? If you're developing a workforce training, credentialing, right, that could have an effect too. I happen to also be on the board of a utility, for example. There's been a long-standing entry program for managerial track folks in a city that is, again, majority Latino. And you see, because of the way the credentialing happens and the gatekeeping, you tend to have candidates that, on the whole, do not represent the population, right? And look, we downstream weren't going to fix the whole education system in Holyoke. They said, well, do we have a credentialing system for other ways for folks that can enter that are on the vocational side, for example, right? I'm sure it must be really hard to get linesmen or folks to fix your vehicles for all these other stuff. And we started a program like that. And lo and behold, it became a lot more representative. And you can have folks go into the institution and move in that way. I know Michael Bowen and his team has been working very strongly to say, well, when we do grants, right, like, who do we want this to benefit? And if we want that type of impact, it's not, are you going to check a box if you're a particular background or ethnicity or skin color? It's, size of the institution, experience. Have you had the opportunity to have these grants before? And so those are really systemic questions, and it's mission driven. You have the outcome in mind, but you're not looking to do what I guess the Supreme Court was trying to avoid, then having a reverse check on race to say, like, well, what is your hue? And if it is this way, then you get the benefit. Is, can we dismantle systems that get to endpoints that we don't agree with? Mm-hmm. And can we have outcomes that are better? And I think when we start tackling those, and it could be it can be in hiring, it could be in procurement of businesses. When we're procuring our house doctors, the numbers of diverse business ownership were in the single digits. In one of our primary programs, the Transformative Development Initiative that works in gateway cities, we said, well, we're going to have house doctors working in these communities. We're not going to make a question whether you're a business owner of color. The question is, if we're going to farm businesses to work in these communities, are we recruiting in these communities? But because we know, in fact, that unfortunately the United States is segregated racially. So we're working in a community. We want people from the community, again, to benefit from this work. So let's recruit and just make the opportunity known. And then lo and behold, you get a lot of people who are qualified for this work. Right? And so now, in that one program, where over 70% of our companies are of color or women, right? So it didn't require us to ask the question, it just required us the effort to dismantle a system that leads to predictable outcomes.
Thank you for that candor. I know some's coming here as well.
I won't belabor the point. I don't know what the vegetarian version of piggybacking is, so I'll just add on to what has been shared so far. And I'll bring it even just down to Boston, because I agree wholeheartedly with Marcos here. There's, on the question of is there greater diversity in economic development, there's the two sides that have been shared here on the panel. One is on the leadership side of who's making the decisions, and then on the other side of who is on the other side of that decision making. In Boston, I think on the diversity piece, just in terms of surface level, I think things have improved. I mean, they're vastly different than they were even 10 years ago, 5 years ago. I mean, first of all, our mayor does not look like every other mayor that's come before her. I mean, the fact that I can say her is the first part, and then she's a woman of color. And then you look at the cabinet, which is the most diverse it's been in the city's history. The people, and not only, I say this, when I go back to places I'm familiar with, that, there are consequential roles that are filled by people that have important experiences that before in other parts of the country, you might hire a couple of folks of color or women, but they're in roles that don't, you're chief diversity officer, right? Which is a great role to have, but not a ton of decision making that happens in that particular, at least in a lot of companies. Whereas in Boston, our chief of planning, right? Before was Arthur Jemison, and now you have Cairo Shen, the health commissioner, Bisola Ojikotu. You have a person over community engagement. You have you have a woman superintendent. You can go on down the list. The most handsome person over economic development. All that kind of stuff. So but it's a hugely different time in the city of Boston, and it matters because the decisions that are being made are way different than how they've been made before. Because a lot of the folks are either coming from these communities or their experiences are that of what and who they inhabit. So that's one piece of it. So on the leadership side, things are getting better, but it doesn't matter if in future years and future administrations, if we're not continuing that track. I think Shirley Young picked up on that last week in her article about we had a ton of Black CEOs, and now many of them have left in a very short amount of time. On the other side of it, and that's just city government, right? And the council, same thing, hugely different than what it has been. But even in the C-suite in Boston, things have changed dramatically. Our major foundations, major nonprofits led by women and people of color. So on that front, it's positive trending, but I mentioned earlier the symbolism versus substance piece because Boston, which and everything we do is to try not to make news. But I will say that Boston for a long time embraced symbolism because we want to be the most progressive city in the union. We're not Mississippi, right? And that's usually what we hang our hat on, is that we're not, like other places. But that doesn't mean that we're the best ever. And I think that Federal Reserve report showed us otherwise. So point is that at least on the surface level, who's leading important changes. And I think that's a real, it's a hallmark for the city's history. On the other side, though, we have a lot of work to do. Even with our coming in, I'll pick up on the procurement piece. It was a very awkward position that I was in coming into this role because the last thing I did as CEO of BECMA was to join a couple of other organizations and, well, let me back up and say, there was a report that came out that showed that out of $2 billion spent over 5 years, 47,000 contracts, 0.4% of those contracts were awarded to Black companies, 0.8 to Latino companies. So, BECMA and Amplify, which is sort of like the chamber for Latino-owned businesses, we decided to sue the city. But, and it was all for, we went to the federal government, we're like, okay, this is, you get to whole numbers by accident. So, clearly there's something going on where there's very few companies owned by people of color getting any business with the city. We made that decision in mid-2021. January 2022, I come into this role as the Chief of Economic Development, where supplier diversity is under us. So my first external meeting, if you're an attorney, you should cover your ears, but my first external meeting was me on one side of the table and our corporation counsel for the city and some other folks across the table from the new CEO of BECMA and Amplify and all the folks talking about what are we gonna do about this lawsuit that, of course, I recused myself, et cetera, et cetera. But just to say that, we were not doing great when it came to who was benefiting or not benefiting from economic development. And today, because of a lot of the policies and I don't know if anyone here is from the State House, but a lot of the initiatives that we pushed through the State House and things we've done on the city level, last year we celebrated that we were at 12% just for minority companies, and this year we'll have a different number at the end of October. Stay tuned for Supplier Diversity Week. But so we're on the right path when it comes to procurement. Same for grants and other things like that. However, when it comes to when you start measuring wealth and who's doing well, city still has a lot of work to do on that because the communities that we live in still need these infusions of capital, but also to make sure that as we're developing these communities, that people get to stay where they are. And of course, we know that one of the biggest challenges for Boston is not just the tea, although it's getting better, and Philang is incredible, but also housing. Folks can't afford to live in our neighborhoods, even neighborhoods that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, people wanted to avoid living in. Communities that I grew up in. I grew up on the Second Pew 12th Baptist Church in Roxbury, on Elm Hill, and they're wonderful places to be, but others avoided it. But now the families I grew up next to have to move to Lawrence or Randolph or other parts of it, or just leave entirely. So I would say that we have a lot of work to do, but Massachusetts, we are heading in the right direction, but we can't take our foot off and just celebrate the fact that we're better than we were before.
I think I'd agree with that. And I can add, I moved to Boston, Massachusetts only a few years ago, and the narratives, the tropes I was hearing before I moved weren't that complimentary. In fact, I was wondering what I was going to find when I got here. But to your point, Sugar, I think things are looking better. But, perceptions are sometimes different to reality in terms of filtered down who ends up benefiting in our communities. And we've heard a few pillars, if I can call them that, of economic development, childcare, housing, transportation. That, in some ways, offers the opportunity for someone to say, I care about that. I want to get into this work. I see, this panel. I want to follow in those footsteps. How does someone actually go about entering this field? What do you see as the kind of route for someone who wants to end up here? Because we know that's probably not straightforward, but are there a few first things people can be researching or getting involved in? I don't know who wants to start with
I'll
that
let
one.
them answer because mine doesn't make any sense. Say yes to everything that comes in front of you. Yeah.
I'm going to let you start because I always end up in.
I think the answer could be as diverse as what is economic development to you. I think I'm going to really answer the question, but the problem is we have to start like really high level because we confuse society with the economy, right? When during COVID, it was like we're closing down society, and people were like, the economy is closed down. Well, not really. We're still producing goods and services. And then we confuse the economy with economic development, which is, I would argue, a different concept, right? We're trying to create value, particularly where I sit and have sat. There are parts of the economy that work by itself. The market in many areas or most areas just works. There is a market. There are buyers, there are sellers. Stuff gets produced that people want, and there you go. You have some level of regulation where it's needed, and that's it. There are a whole bunch of stuff that we want as a society that does not get produced, including stuff that looks like what the market produces, right? Like housing, or like certain types of jobs, or certain goods and services that would not exist but for some level of public sector involvement, right? And that is more the world of economic development. Now I already forgot the question. I went so high level.
You're fine.
Was it? Prompt me again.
So how someone might understand what this looks like, but then how to kind of enter it.
The entry point is as varied as what is the problem that you're trying to solve was the problem that I was getting to, right? So you mentioned childcare, for example. So we most recently integrated a grant program for childcare at Mass Development in partnership with the Early Education Commission, right? So the entry point to run a grant for early education. By the way, the grant program we're running now, it's like home-based childcare capital grants, right? So you may, if you know something about construction and contracting, that could be an entry point. But actually, if you know enough about the business of home care, that's actually the entry point now. This is literally a decision point we have as we're hiring for the position, right? And so there are multiple entry points for that. We have, I mentioned the Transformative Development Initiative earlier. We have 13 gateway cities where we're partners in, and we essentially have a Mass Development employee embedded in a local partnership. Think of them as economic development organizers, right? And their entry points were very varied. We have one who's a lawyer, we have one who's a landscape architect, one has a couple of them have been either small business owners and or have worked at incubators for small businesses. We have an architect, one has done public health, but they have a commonality in the skill set. It's not a credential, but we're looking at is a skill set. Can you deliver on the problem set we have? There's a theme to my pontificating, which is like, what's the outcome we want to see? Then work backwards, who can fill that role in a way that is, they can partner with the stakeholders that we're working with. I think that allows for multiple entry points.
Yeah, absolutely. Sandhya, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so this question has been on my mind for quite some time actually, and I've been working with Peter where he mentioned this earlier as well, that I've been thinking about this, right? I mean, from when I started in my role, I was seated in a conference room. I didn't see a lot of people that looked similar, right? It was getting tougher and tougher for me to get in conversations with folks who one, understand my accent. The other thing was people who would actually acknowledge the knowledge that I brought to the table. So that was when I realized that I had to not just rise myself, but I had to handhold a lot of other folks around me to get to where I see where we need to go to. So some of the things that you just talked about, about doesn't matter your background, it's more about your skill sets that you are bringing. That's when we started talking about maybe creating our own economic development academy and trying to actually provide the skill sets, at least the basis of where we see an architect or a planner or someone who is in a very different, like an engineer, who can actually be in economic development in whatever role they are playing in the community, to bring their skill set, but also to bring economic development as a forefront. Because it's not a job profile that you learn and you're like, oh, I know C++, these are the steps that I'm going to take to get here. It's not the way it works. And all four of us being in economic development, we understand that you could be contributing to the society and to the market, to the economy of your community and the region and the state through various different ways. And that's when we started talking about different education policies that are existing and not having any credentials whatsoever. If you want to, even as an economic development director, I see myself and I'm like, what do I want to be after this? So after that, it's like, how do you make sure that people are in this careers looking at a long-term goal and not looking at this as something that you start and then after 4 years you're like thinking, okay, where do I go next? Right? You're achieved what you've achieved, and now, because the thing is, the challenges of day-to-day economic development are still there. The policy making is still there. The pandemic gave you an opportunity. I feel it was an opportunity, honestly speaking, because a lot of the programs helped us get to policy making and the ability for towns like us to actually be in the grant giving cycle. We didn't have that ability. That's when we started actually using your policy making and helping us get to the procurement policy and getting into grant cycle, wherein we were able to give $4.4 million to like 90 plus businesses in Lexington, but out of that, 75% of the business owners were women and underrepresented business owners, which really was like, when we showed those numbers, that data, Lexington was surprised. They did not know businesses of color existed in Lexington. So they were actually surprised by that data. So when we started working on those policy level things, that's the other thing that we started discussing about what are the basic courses that we really want to design that will help the future economic developers think about how to go about designing these programs that are not just to have new businesses. It's not just business development. It's not just business retention. It's not just helping your neighbors, but it's a lot more of community development. And when you're building a community, you have to start from scratch. You have to think about how do you make this portion the best ever by creating as much mix as possible and not just have one formula.
I'd like to pick up on that, and I'm really hoping that we can leave time for questions. I think we'll be able to.
That's his way of saying we talked too long.
We've shared a few panels, so Shigun knows me well. What I want to do is just pick up on the thread there around presenting data and having some success, even in a smaller portion or segment of what we're looking at, as a route to success and as a route to showing how we can actually do this well, maybe not just in our own towns, but more broadly. So, I'd love to kind of go down the line, and I'll start with you, Shigun, on kind of, best practices or successes you've seen that we could all maybe consider and tweak to try and see more success in our fields of work.
Sure thing. And to carry on even the how do you get into it, I don't know how to answer how, what you should do to get into this, but I will say that there's 1,000 job openings at the city of Boston. I've got 6 of them, so if anyone here is interested. So I'll start by, I like to make the case, because whenever I'm on any panel about equity, diversity, I don't like to assume that everyone in the room is 1,000% bought in, like, yeah, this is important, especially with all that's out there now about how, well, maybe we should think in other ways. So I like to make the case, and then I'll talk about what we've done in the city, and I will be briefer than I have been. So one data point I bring with me, well, there's a report that was released. Citigroup put out a report in 2020 after George Floyd that looked at a bunch of different sectors, and it looked at the wealth gap here in the country. And what it found was that since just the year 2000, because of America's warm embrace of systemic racism in a bunch of different areas, just between black and white families, that the country has lost out on $16 trillion of wealth, just between black and white. So you can only imagine what that number is when you add on other groups to that. That's for the country. Here in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Taxpayer Foundation, which is not known as a liberal organization, but Doug and team are excellent. But they put out a report later in 2020 that found that if we were to close the racial wealth gap just between black and white families across education, healthcare, et cetera, housing here in the Commonwealth, that we'd add $25 billion to the state economy over the next 5 years, which I think we could use, right now. So that's just here. That's here in the Commonwealth. So for me, it's not really just like there's the moral argument for diversity and a focus on equity, particularly racial equity. There's the social argument that we've been making in this country for 100 years. But I think what's also important is that there's the economic argument that actually it is costing us way more to not focus on and address these issues than it is to let things happen the way that they've been happening. So all that said, because at least that is the approach that this administration has been taking, we have prioritized not just equity, but racial equity. And what that means is that in Boston, again, yes, we have our history of, the 54th Massachusetts started here, and we were on the right side of the Civil War and all that kind of, Martin Luther King studied here, all that stuff, right? Ayanna Pressley, right? We love to take credit for all these really important moments in the country's history, but we know we have work to do on the ground. And so the focus on racial equity is ensuring that whenever we're developing programs, policies, or initiatives, that the understanding of equity is baked into the conversation, not something that we tack on at the end after we have developed everything. And that has led to what I mentioned on procurement when it comes to programming, because all of this benefits literally everybody. One program we developed called the Space Program as a data point. One thing that I heard at Beckma, that the mayor heard, as a counselor from a lot of businesses, was the fact that, from any demographic, it's tough in Boston. It's expensive. Any small business that wants to open up down here, you got to have $100,000 saved somewhere, at least, if you want to find the location, build it out, rent, all that kind of stuff. So we developed a program called the Space Program. I had $9 million in ARPA. We gave up to $200,000 to several different, 60 so far. And those entrepreneurs are all across the city, but many of them are in our downtown. 75% of the folks getting the money, people of color, 60% are women. And the important thing about this program, though, is not, we get to clap at the press conference and say, look at these numbers, but these are folks that are creating jobs, and they're the folks that are bringing wealth back into their communities. So as a result of this program, these 61 companies are set to create 600 more jobs here in the city, because they're either opening a new business ever for the first time on their part, or their second or third location, which for me is success in the city. If we're helping small business owners open 2, 3, 4 and franchising all over the country, that's a success story for us. They're creating jobs, they're bringing wealth to the city. So that's just that, just one other point. But so many of the programs that we've been developing, and I wish Secretary Jones were still here, because we're going to be hitting the state up for some money. I'm glad Marcus is still here. A lot of them, they're working, and we're not going to, plaster billboards with the stuff that we're doing, but Secretary Jones mentioned on the life science work, getting 1,000 Bostonians into the life science industry with a focus on people of color and women, because that's where the gap is. The industry itself is looking for this, and so we're helping to onboard it, and we put $9 million behind that. So there's so many programs that we've launched, and that's just in my space, let alone what we've done in housing and making sure that we're helping more people of color own their homes. Down payment assistance, we just announced last week, $7 million more for a program, not just helping families, but folks in our housing authority, people who have the most need in the city, helping them become homeowners. And these are families moving into our neighborhoods, again, building wealth for them. In fact, the woman at the press conference last week literally said, this is how I'm building generational wealth. This is a home that's going to pass down to my son and stay in our family. Generational wealth, like all of that matters for the future of the city. Because listen, there are people, all this, the attacks on at least the conversation on DEI is because people are tired of talking about it and hearing about it. I guarantee you that people are mostly tired of living it. And so if all of us can come together and address the problem, the people who are tired of hearing about it won't have to hear about it anymore. The people who are tired of living it won't need to live it anymore. So I think we can at least agree on that and work together to make it happen.
Fantastic. Thank you. Marcus, any examples, best practices?
I love your data examples, and also like going off of what you were saying, I think visibility is a big, important role for data. Intellectually, I think on some level we all realize, the problems of marginalization or poverty or lack of opportunity, but when you get kind of granular and you go, well, you can unlock $25 billion, it's really hard to ignore. And you go, wow, we didn't know we had 75 businesses that were businesses of color. I mean, that's a visibility problem. People do not conceive that their community is composed partly or in big part by these businesses of color. There's a community that we worked with, I will not identify, where they had a vision of who belonged at the table and what or who was the problem. Right, a community of color, primarily migrant or first, second generation. And we were kind of making the point that they need to be at the table, and it's not a deficit-based approach, but an asset-based approach. This community is also an asset. And so like, what do they do well? What are their aspirations? And we can't define that for them. They have to be at the table to define that for themselves as well. And that's how you get to unlocking opportunity and unlocking economic value from folks. Like there's not some ethereal thing where you just like switch a key and then boom, money comes out. It's like, all right, so what role will we play in the economy? What role do you want to play? And let's build programming towards that. But it starts with visibility. Like if people are like, well, no, it's just, this is a problem. Well, no, it's an asset. How do you unlock the asset? I love those 2 points that you guys made.
And I like that angle. Last but not least.
Quick, Mass Life Sciences Center, I think most of our programs, from tax incentives to internship challenge to apprenticeship challenge, all those programs had definitely, we strive to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible to design the programs, and most of the programs have been successful. I don't want to name the data because it's been 4 years since I've not been working with Mass Life Sciences Center anymore, but those programs definitely are a keystone, I would believe, in developing some of the major policies within life sciences industry to make sure we get the workforce and representing underrepresented workforce in the industry. I think successfully in the past, like 12 years, MLSC has done that. Currently, I did mention about the grants, but we also received ARPA grants similar to the city of Boston, and we received $9 million. Out of that, I think $2 million has been distributed specifically for grants, and that went to, again, I'm going to throw out a number here, but it's almost like out of the $2 million, I think we were able to provide 81 businesses grants, and out of that, 85% were women-owned and minority-owned businesses. That actually has led us to retain a lot of businesses, because most of my thing was most of our small business owners, similar to people moving out of Boston towards Lawrence, our businesses were moving towards Lowell, and we were like, okay, we have to retain these business owners, because they actually are the culture for the town. And I'm missing Mike Bobbitt here, but we just received our cultural district from MCC as well, and our culture has to be retained. And last, housing, 650 new units under the new MBTA zoning that are going to be mixed-use housing. So that's going to help, and tons of several things, but I'm definitely forgetting housing, cultural district. Oh, how can I forget 250th? We're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington. Of course, not just reiterating the stories from the past, we are actually finding new stories about the history and actually bringing untold stories to the front rather than just reiterating the same stories that we've been hearing for the past 250 years. So I think that is also helping diversity and inclusion in the town.
And I must say, it's an interesting time being British with these celebrations in Boston. Pete, do we have time for a couple of questions? Just before we do that, can we say a thank you to our panelists for, really, again, like I said, I was most excited to kind of see and hear the humanity in this work, and it's, for me, really encouraging to know that there are people like these three doing the work. So, if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. I think we've got a microphone coming round. You were first, so if you just wait for the microphone. And I'll ask our panelists to be as brief as possible with our responses.
We'll try.
Thank you all. It's great to see everybody, and the conversation today has been very rich. We live in a pretty privileged community in the Commonwealth in terms of the ecosystem of economic development, community development. We also live in a world, the last 25 years, we haven't seen as much capital, private capital, flow into communities around us. And one would say also that the ecosystem and infrastructure may not have been built to absorb some of that capital in an equitable way, right? So as we think about addressing the racial wealth gap in your respective roles, what would you build new, right, to kind of create some system change, or rebuild, or retire in terms of the toolkits that you're working on today?
Wonderful question. Who'd like to give
30
that a
seconds
go?
or less, right?
I'll try to do 30 seconds or less. I think transactional programs are less apt to meet the moment. So be it a grant, a short-term engagement from a tax break, like those things, just general statement, not covering every program, but they will be much more limited as a toolkit as programs that I think government by and large has to start thinking about. How do you create more sustained relationships that can then wrap around different types of tools, whether it's technical assistance or touching multiple parts of the economic ecosystem, to make sure that then on the ground you have actors that can absorb capital. That means they know what to do with it. They know how to create a capital stack, how to identify the right project, and do something that is adding value to the economy. But it's a much harder time, I think, to be in the public sector, because it's not as easy as like, all right, just create this program and have it, and count how many iterations of it you ran. Like now you need like a general practitioner or doctor to diagnose and then like treat with multiple medications. Makes sense.
Very quick, actually, when you're talking about that, it reminded me of my ex-boss who used to say that if you're in an ecosystem and you're in an ocean, you need the krills, you need the sharks, you need the fishes. So it's like you absolutely have to have a feeder economy to, and that has been missing. I think that's the missing gap here. We've been like really investing in those big sharks in the life sciences industry, and I'm hoping that we are seeing more and more investment going towards the smaller businesses and creating a good balance of not just those large life sciences companies, but also those incubated smaller companies that actually are the innovation economy for Massachusetts.
30 seconds or less.
Wait, yes, I know, yes. Well, he already knows my answer because we've been talking. But a couple of things I'll say, and I've already used up 15 of the seconds, so I will just say that One is, if I were to create something new, there's an organization out in Detroit called Invest Detroit. I would love to have a version of Invest Detroit in Boston so that, to the point about the public sector, the city really doesn't have those types of tools. I mean, really the only entity we were able to ever use for its long history was the BPD, well, now the planning department, but the formerly BRA, BPDA, and now planning department. So I would love something like that. But I will say that, to your point too about all this capital, I mean, yeah, so much of it, even here in the Commonwealth, and this is not an academic way of understanding this, but I used to say at BACMA all the time, I don't know if I'm allowed to say here, but just to say that I think what's missing is trust, period. I think we do have the people and the organizations and the structures to receive that capital, particularly those led by people of color and women. I think the thing that's missing is trust. I think that folks are just still not trusted to manage and disperse a ton of that capital for various reasons, and I think that's one thing that's missing here. Because I see a lot of great, Builders of Color Coalition as an entity has identified a lot of folks that could help manage that, get it out to where it needs to go, and it still doesn't come, and I think it's part of it's a lack of trust. There was 35 seconds, but I apologize.
No, and what was the name of that entity in Detroit?
Builders of Color Coalition.
Oh, no, in Detroit, sorry.
Oh, Invest Detroit.
Invest
Yeah.
Detroit, thank you. Any other questions? I think I saw a hand over here. And feel free to introduce yourself as well.
My name is Winston. I'm gonna have to say thank you for such an engaging, insightful conversation. My question is twofold. One is specifically for Segun, and the other might be for the three of you as well. So last week there was a Supreme Court ruling in Kentucky that blocked transportation programs within the airport. So at the airport there is a program we call ACDBE, Airport Concession Disadvantaged Business Enterprise, that allow infuse of money for minorities and women to create a concession within the airport setting. And as of last week, this program has been partially blocked. And there's a lot of conversation. This is the end of DEI within the airport setting. This has been a trend since last year when we had the Affirmation Action program being blocked in high school and in college. And the same activist that is going on those federal programs is the one that is currently going after disadvantaged business enterprise opportunities for minorities and women within any federal programs. Now, some of you, I know Segun, in addition to being a public servant, also a very active member of the community. Both as an active member of the community and now within being in the government setting, what is the hope? What can government do in that way when you are ruling? Now, if Supreme Court will, it become the law of the land. And one thing we all agree, there's importance for this kind of infusion of cash within minority community. Now we're seeing this program being blocked. What is the way forward? That's the one. The other question, as you know, Massport oversees a lot of portfolio real estate as well. Last month, the Boston Globe published an article that said within the past 4 years, none of those big construction projects meet the residency requirement for hiring Boston residents. What is your take on that? Have you seen this article from Boston Globe?
Yep. Where I think the title was like, they don't take it seriously or something like that. I can't remember who wrote it.
It's a joke. It's a big joke, something.
Yes,
That's the headline.
exactly, yes, big joke, yes. Okay, I'm sorry, I can't do 30 seconds. But I will not take forever. So, and I'll go quickly. So on the first question, and everyone heard the question, okay. So on the first question about just overall how diversity initiatives, private initiatives have been attacked, right? We saw that happen in Atlanta, and now there's the effort to essentially make it illegal at the state and federal level. This is something we've been thinking about since we came in. It's not the first time, at least when it comes to procurement, it's not the first time that these types of programs have been attacked. The first time I ever read about anything like this was in Atlanta when in the early 70s, their first black mayor, Maynard Jackson, he became mayor, and the Atlanta airport, which is now one of the best in the world, was not what it was now then. Part of the redevelopment, he said all these developers in a room and said, if you all want contracts, I need 35% of these contracts to go to people of color. And they tried to make that not happen, but he won in the end, and now all the black millionaires coming out of Atlanta can essentially trace their roots back to this decision to make sure that black and brown folks got contracts on this major government initiative. Then came the Croson decision at the Supreme Court level that said that way of doing it is illegal. So I guess the short answer to your question of how do we operate in a world where the Supreme Court, given how it's made up right now, and depending on what happens in November, could be even worse, it is fated to happen in that way. My short answer is we adapt. Until then, I've said to our legal team, you know, unless Michael Cox, who's the commissioner of the Boston Police Department, is going to come into my office and arrest me for making sure that we are meeting our diversity and equity goals, I'm going to keep making sure that women and people of color get contracts with the city through the policies, right? It's all competitive, and of course, there's no all that other stuff. And if worse comes to worse, I'm calling Nutter to defend us, and you know, and all that other stuff. So that's the answer for the Supreme Court, but it is something that we are, from January 2022, in the front of our minds of, is what we're putting together gonna be the case that leads to the Supreme Court making a decision to say you can't do that. So we're always thinking about that. On the question about you know, participation in city contracts and whether or not there are Boston residents that are participating, et cetera. So for those who may not know, in the late 80s, or actually early 80s, under Kevin White, and then under Mayor Flynn, there's something called the Boston Residents Jobs Policy, which is meant to try to guarantee on major projects in the city that women, people of color, Boston residents are getting a significant amount of participating in the workforce on that side. And there was a recent report that showed that at least on the women and people of color, things are improving, but on the Boston resident side, not so much, very little participation. And actually the BRJP used to live under me, and now it lives under the Worker Empowerment Cabinet under Trin Nguyen. So this is something that we saw when we were, when I first came in. No excuses, but I will say, part of it is the fact that a lot of the people who are getting the work now are part of the unions, which a lot of our projects are union focused. And because of our housing problem, they cannot afford to live in the city. So that's partly why it's been difficult for us to reach the Boston resident piece, that we're requiring that folks be in the unions, which is important, for making sure that wages are much higher than where they are, and also that they're safe on the projects they're working on. So we've done a better job of getting folks in the union, of getting awarded these projects, but we've not done a great job of making sure that Boston's an affordable place to be, so that folks are also buying their homes or renting here in the city. So there's work, it's all tied together, as been mentioned, right? That it's not just let's go pick someone up and go work on the project. It's all integrated into all the other things that we have to address as a city, which we're actively working on. The mayor, you know, we got a little bit more than Lexington and ARPA. We got around 400 million, and 500 rather, we inherited 400. 200 of it's gone to helping to stimulate the building of affordable housing. You know, we're grateful what the state's doing on that as well. So we'll hope those numbers will change around very shortly.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Well, time's up. Thank you for that. Thank you to all of our panelists. And I think I'm going to pass back to Pete.
Yeah, before I ask you all to give a huge round of applause to this terrific panel, well, go ahead. Let's give just, you know, a fantastic job. We're so thankful that you did this for us this morning. Thank you so much. I'll just, one story I'll share. It wasn't an economic development position, but I was director of the governor's Western Massachusetts office. It was based out in Springfield. It was during the Cellucci administration. And I was asked by the governor and the chief of staff, you know, what are the two most important economic development projects in Western Massachusetts right now? And I gave my answer. I've been to all the meetings. I thought I had the answer. I gave the answer. And I passed the two. They were successes. Very good things happened. I passed those two sites now, and I'm very proud of that. But I think of this conversation. I said, did I give the right answer? I was the only person in the room at the time. Who else should have been in that room? And I think any three of our panelists, would they have given a different answer? And so it really gets down to, you know, who is in the room when these decisions are being made, and when the programs are being developed, when the funding is being released, who's in the room. And so this is a wonderful discussion. Very thankful on behalf of all of us at MassEcon that you joined us this morning. Thank you to our audience. This is important to us at MassEcon. We're going to carry this conversation forward. We're going to really try to integrate what we learned today in what we do as an organization. And so we're thankful. Thank you so much. One last tiny little pitch for upcoming MassEcon program, our Massachusetts Corporate Welcome Reception on October 24th, where we get to welcome businesses that are brand new to Massachusetts within the past year. And we're happy to have some from Boston, from around the state, and so we'd certainly love to see you at that event as well, coming up later in October 24th. So again, one more round of applause to our wonderful panel and moderator. We're so thankful. Everybody have a great day.